Until recently, the humanistic impulse has been central to literary criticism in the West. 10 years ago, however, Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind warned that our culture, which boasts of its unprecedented openness, was in danger of closing off the debate over philosophical alternatives that begins for us with the Greeks. Today, it appears that not only the philosophical tradition, which was Bloom's main concern, is in danger, but the humanistic tradition of literary criticism is also threatened. Most frequently, the attack is carried on in the name of a new putative superdiscipline, cultural studies, which claims to transcend and render obsolete not only the traditional humanities, but also the social sciences and perhaps even the hard sciences of biology, chemistry, and physics. Remember Alan Sokal? Mainstream cultural studies posits a world where sex is only gender, morality is only lifestyle, and novels, plays, and poems are merely texts. Will the humanistic tradition outlast cultural studies? Does it deserve to? In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom reaffirms the significance of the humanistic tradition in two somewhat contradictory ways. On the one hand, the book is itself an impressive example of humanistic criticism, contemptuously debunking the intellectual pretensions of nihilism American style. Bloom demonstrates the necessity of confronting directly the masterpieces of literature and philosophy in undertaking any serious exploration of what it means to be human. On the other hand, the affinity of Bloom's intellectual romanticism with the very spirit of the time that he's questioning suggests the need for a corrective emphasis available from exemplars of the humanistic tradition of literary criticism like Ralph Ellison and Irving Babbitt. In The Closing of the American Mind, Bloom adopts phrases ordinarily associated with the cultural left to describe his own educational ideals. The university, he says, should encourage the awareness of other possibilities and cultivate alternative thoughts to promote an awareness of difference in order to liberate reason. Only in such a countervailing atmosphere will it be possible to conceive alternative goals. Of course, the alternatives Bloom has in mind, of course, are not radical feminism or multiculturalism, but instead an aristocratic respect for tradition and intransigently high standards. Well, if the chief obligation of a university, and especially of the humanities, could be summed up as the stimulation of alternative thoughts in order to liberate reason, then the case Bloom makes for aristocratic values would be entirely convincing. But the notion that the highest praise one can bestow on an idea is conveyed by the adjective alternative should not be accepted too easily, even when it is asserted by Alan Bloom. The notion that the highest and best and most vital, whatever it may be, is at all events to be found elsewhere than in one's own heritage and society is one of the most long-lasting and influential themes of the Romantic movement. Non-romantics should not be too quick to turn away from the ideals of liberal democracy to the ideals of an erstwhile aristocracy in search of a commitment to high standards of art and thought. Ralph Ellison, for example, has argued persuasively for an affinity between American democratic culture and high literary and artistic standards. He points out in the United States, to an extent much greater than in other countries, refinement of sensibility is not confined to those favored by family background, formal education, or social status. Ellison asserts that the American artist will do his best because he entertains the possibility that however far out in the boondocks one might be, quoting, any American audience will conceal at least one individual whose knowledge and taste will complement or surpass the artist's own. There is, that is, quoting, no necessary contradiction between our vernacular style and the pursuit of excellence. Practitioners of jazz, the best known example of American vernacular art, are, according to Ellison, unreconstructed elitists when it comes to maintaining the highest standards of the music which expresses their sense of the American experience. Well, Alan Bloom is surely right to argue that the university in general and the humanities in particular have a special obligation to challenge those assumptions in contemporary culture that would otherwise go unquestioned. The example of Ralph Ellison suggests that the principles behind such questioning need not be derived entirely from other places and times, but from our own democratic ideals as well. More importantly, Ellison and Bloom, each in their own way, demonstrate that the humanistic tradition remains a resource for those unwilling to surrender to contemporary trends. There remains a question, however, to what extent Alan Bloom's own passionate enthusiasms put him in implicit agreement with some of the most questionable trends of contemporary culture. Bloom indeed describes his entire book as a plea for authentic liberation, thus choosing two of the most notable cant words of contemporary Romanticism to characterize his project. One of the central themes of closing, the reality and the significance of the difference between the philosophers and ordinary people, parallels the characteristically romantic notion of a gulf between the genius and everybody else. Alan Bloom asserts that between true philosophers and the rest of us, quoting, the gulf is unbridgeable, since, quoting, the philosophers have entirely different ends than the rest of mankind. Bloom's view of the philosophers may be compared to the narrator's description at the beginning of F. Scott Fitzgerald's story, The Rich Boy, when he says that the very rich are different from you and me. The presentation of that rich boy, Anson Hunter, in that story, and of Tom and Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby, careless people who smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness and let other people clean up the mess they had made, demonstrates that Fitzgerald himself saw beyond his own romantic fantasies. Alan Bloom, however, never changed his mind about the philosophers, never grew disillusioned. Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, found a great deal to criticize about Jay Gatsby. Nevertheless, he could not help admiring Gatsby for his romantic readiness, for his heightened sensitivity to the promises of life. Even in retrospect, he stands by the affirmation he had shouted across the lawn when he left Gatsby for the last time. They're a rotten bunch. They're a rotten crowd. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. Well, those of us who appreciate Alan Bloom's own romantic readiness to appreciate the greatness of literature and philosophy may well feel that Nick Carraway's comment, they're a rotten crowd, you're worth the whole damn bunch put together, makes the appropriate comparison between the critics who denounced the closing of the American mind and Alan Bloom himself. Bloom's romantic readiness, dramatized by his teenage wonder at the fake Gothic buildings of the University of Chicago, allowed him to sense and to communicate to his readers much that is truly wonderful. The promise of exemption from the frustrations and difficulties of the common human lot is immensely seductive, as Bloom himself occasionally recognized. In criticizing, quoting, the alleged superior moral concern of the students of the 60s, he paid tribute to a very different version of morality. Quoting, he said, there is a perennial and unobtrusive view that morality consists in such things as telling the truth, paying one's debts, respecting one's parents, and doing no voluntary harm to anyone. Those are all things easy to say and hard to do. They do not attract much attention and win little honor in the world. It is to Bloom's credit that he articulated this prosaic morality so sympathetically, since it seems at odds not only with the histrionic version of moral conduct of the protesting students, but also with his own intimations that life lived without the illumination of a philosophic conversion is a second-rate affair at best. Reading Bloom's speculation that, quoting again, men may live more truly and fully in reading Plato and Shakespeare than at any other time, because then they are participating in essential being and forgetting their accidental lives. One can appreciate his passion for the great authors and still feel that the dismissal of family, work, love as accidental is a romantic error akin to the one enacted by those students who rejected the claims of family and everyday obligations in the name of some authentic moral gesture. Bloom's romanticism, I think, requires a corrective emphasis available from Irving Babbitt. Babbitt's own masters are those thinkers who have turned to literature as a source of insight about human life and who in turn have proposed grounds for judging literature itself. Aristotle, first and foremost, Boileau, Samuel Johnson, Lessing, Sainte-Beuve, and Matthew Arnold, among others. Unlike Bloom, Babbitt does not set his heroes apart from other human beings. Literature is at least as important as philosophy because men and women, including even the greatest philosophers, cannot apprehend reality, as quoting, directly, but only through imaginative symbols. Skepticism about the possibility of achieving truth through reason alone leads Babbitt to turn to literary fictions for insight into the human condition. Whereas Bloom seeks a primary natural experience that can bring about a liberation or a conversion, separating the philosopher from other human beings, Babbitt finds in literature an affirmation of a general nature, a core of normal experience that most human beings, those who are not saints, descend below when they attempt to rise above. Babbitt reaffirms the centrality of the unromantic virtues of moderation, common sense, and common decency, while acknowledging that, quoting again, the uncultivated human imagination in all times and places is romantic. The case for humanistic cultivation depends in large part on the evidence literature provides that romantic yearning, this is quoting again, is found finally not to make for the happiness of the individual. The romantic, Babbitt points out, seeks happiness, and yet on his own showing, his mode of seeking it results not in happiness, but in wretchedness. Well, Alan Bloom, Ralph Ellison, and Irving Babbitt share the faith that great literature provides both aesthetic pleasure and moral insight. For humanistic critics, however, the greatest value literary study may have is the critical filter it provides for the social, political, and artistic nostrums of one's own time. One is less likely to believe that a currently fashionable philosophy is the summation of human wisdom if one is able to measure the current fashion not only by one's own experience, but by the experience embodied in the Iliad, the Divine Comedy, or Pride and Prejudice. This critical perspective may seem to be a small thing, but common sense, one of Babbitt's key terms of praise, is surely no less valuable because it is unpretentious. Those who reject past culture as irrelevant because it is not postmodern, or because it is tainted with sexism or racism or logocentrism, deprive themselves of such guidance. Well, as a professor of literature, I believe I have an obligation to acquaint students with guides like Homer, Dante, and Jane Austen. This is harder than it sounds. The would-be humanist must reject the temptation to substitute the teaching of a ready-made doctrine, even, say, the New Humanism of Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer More, for the much more difficult task of introducing students to the Iliad, Divine Comedy, or Pride and Prejudice. One cannot teach without making some theoretical assumptions, but one can attempt to use theory not as an end, but as a means to come to terms with the works themselves. For the future of humanistic literary criticism is finally one with the future of literature. If poems, plays, novels, and even intellectual autobiographies, like The Closing of the American Mind, continue to exercise their hold on us, as I believe they will, through the postmodernist era and beyond, then the future of the humanistic tradition of literary criticism is assured, since its only necessary ground is the significance and authority of literature. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thanks to John, thanks to Annette, and for allowing me to be here. And I said I'm honored to be at this panel. The two previous papers have been wonderful. I'm taking a little different approach. I'm glad I'm not going to read about Plymouth anyway. I'm not going to write. The Midwest is often described as America's heartland. The connotations of the term vary according to the view of America held by the speaker or writer, but not even the most enthusiastic defenders of the cultures of New England or the South or the coast argue that their region is the true heartland rather than the Midwest. Instead, the assertion of the special moral and cultural excellence of New England or the South or the coast has expressed itself as a desire to secede politically, or at least culturally, from the rest of the United States. The impulse to secession has recurred throughout American history. Irving Babbitt believed that the key that unlocks American history was the conflict between what he called our great unionist tradition that recognizes the need for constitutional limits on government and moral limits on the individual, and an opposing tradition that defines freedom as the absence of limits on both the individual and the state. According to the latter, the secession of either an individual from society or a state from the nation is merely an exercise in freedom. Well, of course, the most notable example of secession in American history is the rebellion of the southern states that received its philosophical justification from John Calhoun's notion that slavery was not a necessary evil, but instead a positive good. Secession, however, also had its attractions for some of the most vehement opponents of slavery, the New England abolitionists led by William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison famously called the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, and argued that the only moral course for the opponents of slavery was withdrawal from the nation. Garrison concluded his July 4th address in 1854 with the declaration that the only remedy in our case is a dissolution of the Union. And those are all capitalized in the original, a dissolution of the Union. Well, the nation was cleansed from the stain of slavery by the Civil War, but the society that emerged with its vulgar new rich, its big city bosses, and its waves of immigrants seemed an alien country to scions of distinguished older families such as Henry and Brooks Adams. In his despair, Henry Adams was eloquently contemptuous of, quoting, the total, irremediable, radical rottenness of our whole social, industrial, financial, and political system, unquote. Well, today there are many, perhaps especially on the coast, not only on the coast, but who may lack Henry Adams' heritage and learning, but who share his feeling that American culture and society are rotten to the core. Such coasties, to use Deirdre McCloskey's some mildly pejorative term, reject the notion that they owe any special loyalty to the United States despite their legal status as citizens. Morally and culturally, if not legally, they have seceded from the Union to become citizens of the world. The United States, for them, is an exceptional nation only in that it uses an exceptionally large portion of the world's resources and is responsible for an exceptionally large share of the world's problems. Well, Russell Kirk, a lifelong Michigander, became famous with the publication of The Conservative Mind in 1953. At first glance, and maybe even at a second, the conservative mind seems to represent a point of view closer to that of a would-be secessionist from the East, South, or the coasts, rather than a representative of the region Abraham Lincoln called the land of steady habits. The book's emphasis on Edmund Burke and other English thinkers, its near silence about such central American political figures as Lincoln, and its respectful attitude toward the antebellum Southern conservatism of John Calhoun suggested to some of the original readers that its author found little worth conserving in 20th century America. A reader of the first edition of The Conservative Mind could be forgiven for suspecting that Kirk's condemnation of the modern world and, a fortiori, the United States, was at least as severe as those issued by radicals on the political left. Kirk's grounds for condemnation were not identical to those offered by the leftists, but they were not entirely different either. Certainly both were all-encompassing. Kirk found himself confronting, quoting here, a world that damns tradition, exalts equality, and welcomes change. A world that has clutched at Rousseau, swallowed him whole, and demanded profits yet more radical. A world smudged by industrialism, standardized by the masses, consolidated by government. A world crippled by war, trembling between the colossi of East and West, and peering over a smashed barricade into the gulf of disillusion. Henry Regnery, the book's publisher, reports that Kirk's first choice for a title was The Conservative Rout, wording unlikely to attract readers, as Regnery pointed out to him, but reflecting Kirk's belief that from the vantage of the middle of the 20th century, An honest conservative would have to admit that, quoting, by and large, radical thinkers have won the day. For a century and a half, conservatives have yielded ground in a manner which, except for occasionally successful rearguard actions, must be described as a rout. To be a conservative in America, the book seemed to suggest, was to be doomed to failure. Kirk pays tribute to the Southern conservatism of John Randolph and John C. Calhoun, but admits that their conservatism was hopelessly entangled with the defense of the indefensible, so that even in the South, their philosophical conservatism was ignored. Again, quoting, the great majority of Southern people, indeed, never apprehended much more of the doctrines of Randolph and Calhoun than their apology for slavery and its defense through state powers, unquote. Yet, in conservative mind, Randolph and Calhoun's ideas are given a chapter of their own, while the ideas of the great opponent of slavery and secession, Abraham Lincoln, go unmentioned. The declining influence of successive generations of the Adams family, John Quincy Adams, and later Henry and Brooks Adams, provides evidence of the hostility of American culture to conservative ideas. Henry Adams, and here's quoting, the end product of 4 generations of exceptional rectitude and remarkable intelligence, very likely the best educated man American society has produced, unquote, seemed to Kirk to represent, quite possibly, quoting, the zenith of American civilization, unquote. He and his brother Brooks represent, according to the book, the courageous and prescient conservative tradition that John Adams founded. Well, Kirk may not agree with Adams, Henry Adams, that, quoting, the laws of thermodynamics are our doom, but his exposition is so sympathetic that one cannot help but feel that he understands and almost accepts Adams' pessimism about the modern world and America. In an era when the Adamses seemed the voice of American conservatism, it is no surprise that, quoting again, by the time the First World War ended, true conservatism was nearly extinct in the United States, unquote. Well, the first edition of the Conservative Mind was subtitled From Burke to Santayana. Well, George Santayana was an important philosopher, a perceptive social critic, and a master of English prose. But to choose him as the last spokesman for the conservative tradition was virtually to concede that conservatism had no future in America. Ranking with Tocqueville as one of the great analysts of American culture, Santayana was personally and philosophically at odds with American society. For him, the Declaration of Independence was a salad of illusions. Santayana observed that in America there is but one way of being saved. According to the national orthodoxy, one must accept wholeheartedly the gospel of work and the belief in progress, neither of which Santayana himself could accept at all. And shortly after writing his famous essay on the genteel tradition in American philosophy, he resigned from his professorship at Harvard after receiving a small inheritance and left the United States, never to return. So the first readers of the Conservative Mind might be pardoned for thinking of its author as a sort of spiritual secessionist. And indeed, it is understandable that a half century that saw 2 world wars, the triumph of Marxism in Russia and China, and the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, might well lead a believer in the permanent things to secede, if only in thought, from one's country and from the modern world. We are all, at one point or another, secessionists, Ralph Ellison once observed, even as he warned against such a, quoting, retreat in dereliction of our most sacred commitments, unquote. Well, Russell Kirk no doubt knew moments of despair, but his long, illustrious career testifies that despite temptations, he did not surrender to the seductions of the impulse to secessionism, political, cultural, or spiritual. Indeed, in the years after the publication of the first edition of The Conservative Mind, Kirk qualified, altered, and deepened his conservatism and his view of the United States. In his magisterial study of Western culture from its beginnings in Israel, Greece, and Rome to the present-day United States, The Roots of American Order, which of course Gleaves has referred to, American society no longer appears as merely the leading edge of a destructive modernism, but instead as a society that has achieved, at the very least, a tolerable order that should arouse not indignation and condemnation, but appreciation and gratitude. Abraham Lincoln now receives his due as a conservative in the highest sense, one who upholds not only the political order, but also the moral order on which the former depends. Kirk declares that, quoting, "In Abraham Lincoln, the American democracy would find at its sternest crisis of disorder its most capable and self-sacrificing man of order." For Kirk, the example of Lincoln, quoting, proved that a democracy of elevation can uphold resolutely the public order and the moral order, unquote. The United States that Lincoln did so much to preserve and enrich now seems an exceptional nation, one that has been spared the afflictions, moral and material, that have ravaged so many other nations. Kirk declares that, quoting, "Anyone who appreciates the legacy of moral and social order which he has inherited in America will feel gratitude," unquote. Writing more than 2 decades after The Conservative Mind was published, Kirk finds reasons to declare the American order a conspicuous success, quoting, "Whatever the failings of America in the 8th decade of the 20th century, the American order has been a conspicuous success in the perspective of human history. Under God, a large measure of justice has been achieved. The state is strong and energetic. Personal freedom is protected by laws and customs, and a sense of community endures." Here, Kirk speaks with the voice of the Heartland, one that acknowledges American failings, but also recognizes the ways in which this nation is truly exceptional. In The Roots of American Order, his true magnum opus, Russell Kirk returned to his Midwestern roots. Thank you.